how facilitators and schools can use your existing data to share your successes with your community, and then also in part use those data to hopefully not only sustain implementation, but also expand implementation, and thus having a greater impact on the children, youth, adolescents, families, and communities whom you serve. And so it's my pleasure to join you all today. And again, many thanks to Delaware County folks who initially kind of asked these questions, and that spurred Tina and I and others on the state leadership team to decide, why don't we do a training for the whole state? But I would also be remiss if I didn't specifically call out some other folks like Don Moss at IU10 and others going way back a number of years who initially were requesting for these kinds of data stories from our research team here at IUP, which back when we only had 60 or 80 sites that were participating in the PA-PBS network, actually before it was even called the PA-PBS network, that was manageable for us to handle here at IUP. But now that we have over, by my count, close to 1,100 school-aged sites, that's not including early intervention program-wide, but over 1,100 sites at the school-age level, it's just not tenable for us here at IUP to offer very specific support to schools and districts as they want to tell their story through data. And therefore, it is my hope, our hope today, that you walk away with a little bit of information about how you might be able to support the schools with whom you work and the programs with whom you work to support sustaining and expanding your efforts to reach a wider audience, and doing that through, in part, data. And if you know anything about me, you know that I love data. When my family and I go on vacations, I'm reading stat books and data books. My kids look at me funny. Actually, now they're kind of accustomed to it because I've been doing it for so long. And it sometimes has my wife a little concerned that I'm going deep into these rabbit holes of data. But it's just my passion. It's what I love to do. And I cannot thank all of you enough. I mean this genuinely. I can't thank all of you enough for all of your, many of you, at least for the past 13 years, in getting data from your schools and sharing that with the patent offices, which subsequently then the research team here at IUP and I have the luxury, the privilege, the honor of analyzing and summarizing each year. And as Tina noted, the executive summary that was just publicly made available a few months or so ago is available via that link, or also on the PA-PBS network website. So thank you all for making my job a lot easier and a lot more fun, because I get a lot of data. And I also want to particularly thank all of you in this given year for the incredible work that you and your schools have been doing in, not to use the term that's overused, but unprecedented year that we all experience. I have it really easy. I get to sit in the ivory tower and teach classes via Zoom and do research via Zoom and occasionally consult via Zoom. All of you in the schools that you support, and I know many schools are back face-to-face and have been back face-to-face for a long time, and others are still kind of inching in that direction. The work that you and your colleagues are doing is absolutely incredible. And I don't think educators get enough credit for dealing with the year that has been a year unlike no other. And as a parent, as an ad hoc local school board subcommittee member, and as just a concerned citizen, I want to thank all educators and all of you for the great work that you have done this year, knowing and appreciating just how challenging it has been. Yet we are still here, and we're still able to look at the positive effects that we have on kids. And so I wanted to take a few moments to take a bird walk there briefly and thank all of you for that support. Great work that you and your colleagues. Okay, so we'll move on now. We'll finally get on to maybe why you signed up for this. I want to talk today for the next hour and 15 minutes or so about how we can use data stories to support program-wide and school-wide PBIS. I certainly want to thank a number of organizations and individuals. By the way, I finally made it through a PBIS workshop in which you will only see one pyramid or triangle, and it's right here. There are no other pyramid. It's hard to believe. Usually when we talk about PBIS, we got pyramids all over. The only one. But I want to thank our partners across the state and nationally, Kent McIntosh and colleagues at the National Training Center and PBIS Apps. And then, of course, the research team here at IUP that I have had the privilege of working with, Dr. Mark Scavett, Sadie Brian, and Tyler Myers, who are both graduate assistants who are doing a very mean thing to me. They are leaving for internship at the end of this summer. And so, no, actually, it's a good thing. They're going out into the real world, but they have been staunch supporters of this work and continue to support and work with me. So I want to thank all of those partners. I also just need to, for ethically responsible reasons, just note the disclaimer that this presentation is in part funded by an external grant that we received from IU13 and Patton Harrisburg. And of course, I'm not speaking on behalf of those fiscal agents. I'm speaking on behalf of myself and myself only. So when we talk about evaluations, here is the latest and greatest refrigerator magnet from the National Center on PBIS implementation. For those who haven't yet seen this, it's a nice little visual representation of the evaluative process. And this evaluative process is specific to systems level evaluations. Now, need to disclose that actually the TA Center on PBIS recommends that this framework is really for state level evaluations, but I think we can draw a lot of this information from the state level evaluations down to districts, programs, and even individual schools and program or building. I think we can take a lot from that work that is generally focused on very large scale evaluations, statewide evaluations, and it applies in your settings as well. And as a note, I do participate in quarterly meetings with my counterparts in other states that do statewide evaluations of PBIS at the school age level. And we all are really wrestling with what to do with the 2019-2020, as well as the current academic year. Even folks like Kent McIntosh and Don Kincaid at South Florida are all like, we're not really sure what this is going to look like in terms of evaluating data from last academic year and the current academic year. Understandably so, no one has ever faced this situation. So we are literally, as the adage suggests, we're building this plane as we're flying. But notably, this is the process that we use for evaluation. Planning that evaluation, then conducting the evaluation, reporting results, and then using those results to continually improve what we are doing. And so maybe you're not quite as familiar or have not seen this visual, but you might have seen this because this has been around for a couple of years in the PBIS world. And when we think about continuous quality improvement, we're using data as the center or the focus of everything we do in terms of evaluating our planning what we do with that, and then implementing those plans based upon the evaluative data that we have offered. So in terms of what we do at a school level, and maybe even more specifically in most of our circumstances, would be at an individual kid level. If you're talking like tier 3 or maybe tier 2 or tier 1, so small group or whole school-wide level, this process, hopefully, if you're familiar with PBIS implementation, seems relatively well established. It's your standard operating procedure. You evaluate a problem with precision. So we write those precision statements that all good behaviorists are certainly very familiar with and all PBISers are aware of and used. And we establish goals based upon those precise statements. We develop solutions, then we implement those solutions and make sure that we're evaluating the integrity of those solutions to ensure that what we prescribe actually was done. Then we collect data and monitor the outcomes of those efforts, and we compare that back to our original goal. And then we reassess and we revise that solution as needed. This circular process, whether it's described or illustrated this way or in probably dozens of other ways that are essentially the same thing, is all part of our DNA. It's what we do as PBIS facilitate. It's just simply what we do. And so we're going to take this logic and apply it to a systems level. It's really no different, except we're talking about a lot more data as well as possibly other types of data. Whereas, when we're working with an individual kid, it might be some sort of pro-social or disruptive behavior that we're trying to advance or reinforce or mitigate or reduce, respectively. In the same sense, we're going to be using those same processes for school-wide or program-wide larger scale. So the process is the same, but it's probably going to be different data. And I'm going to share with you some examples of types of data that you might consider. But most importantly, for our purposes right now, we're going to use this continuous quality improvement for systems level PBIS. And when I refer to systems level, I mean a school building or a program like a preschool intervention, Head Start, early intervention, something like that. Or it could be districts or groups or clusters of programs, a program that might have multiple sites. It could even be an entire IU or a region of a county. The system itself is entirely up to you, but we're definitely talking at the smallest level, an entire building, and then anything bigger or superordinate from there. We're going to apply this logic to those systems level structures. Now, the specifics of how we go about doing this quality improvement will depend on a variety of factors, inclusive of the purpose, stakeholders, focus, and available data. And that is what I'm going to flesh out here in a few moments. Let's take that same same circular logic that we all know about in terms of supporting an individual student, or maybe using it at a tier 2 level for small groups, or perhaps we've used it at a tier 1 level, which I hope everybody has done, for example, when looking at monthly ODR data or behavior incident reports, data for our program-wide folks, and you say, okay, given these data, what are the data tell? What do we then do to change things? What's an intervention or a plan or a strategy? Let's implement that. Let's monitor its integrity and let's evaluate its efficacy and make a decision about what to do. So that same circular logic that we have always applied to kids at the individual level, small group, or whole building level, let's apply it to systems. And what does that look like? It's going to essentially be very similar. First, we need to identify what is the purpose of our systems level evaluation. Why are we doing it in the first place? Then we want to identify key stakeholders, because you got to know who are the individuals to whom this work is focused on. And you need to identify who those stakeholders are. And again, I'm going to flesh out each of these in subsequent slides. So right now, this is just a simple overview or a advanced organizer for what is about to come. Then you need to select your team and set a timeline for doing the evaluation. Here is a critical one: defining your core evaluation question. I say it's critical because this is what drives your subsequent work. And it is very difficult to midstream or toward the end of this process decide, oh, we need to add core evaluation questions. This happens to us at IUP when we're analyzing data every year. We're always like, ooh, that'd be a really cool question to ask. But if the ship has sailed, the train has left the station, it is too far into the process to be able to answer those questions now. We just establish those questions the next time we do this circling or cyclical process. So you need to define your core evaluation questions, and then based upon that, identify how are you operationalizing the data that will be used to answer those core evaluation questions. And as a little bit of a preview here, I am not advocating for more data collection. Rather, I am advocating for looking around at the data that you already have. It is my experience that schools are swimming in data, particularly schools that are implementing PBIS, at least at a tier 1 level. You have more than enough data to really harvest and package in a way that is supportive of your evaluative efforts at a systems level. But we need to talk a little bit about what some of those evaluation measures might be. And then finally, we use our evaluation results to package them in a format and a modality that suits the needs of the stakeholders. And those results are then used to inform the next cyclical process. In my view, this process is an annual process, but it could be a little bit briefer. Although I think if you try to do it in a half year or so, it's going to get a little muddy. Probably best to wait and do this once a year. But as we will see in a little bit, there are benchmarks across the year that need to be met in order to complete the entire circle in a year. Therefore, that forms the basis of our agenda. That's hopefully an introduction to what is going to be the remainder of our 60 or so minutes together. You've noticed that on the previous slide, I had 6 or 7 different arrows coming off of that circular visual. I've condensed those down into 5 agenda items, largely because some of them are a little bit briefer in content than others. So we're going to start off by talking about what is the purpose of your systems level program evaluation. Okay. Everybody in PBIS world knows this refrigerator magnet. It's been around for a long, long time. In fact, some of us have it tattooed on our back. Where this comes up is, of course, on the right-hand quadrant, or top right, in terms of using data to support the decisions that we make, not about necessarily individual kids or about small groups of kids or maybe even grade levels or age level. Instead, we're going to look at this through the lens of supporting decisions at a systems level. Things such as, if a school board member is asking you, why are we dedicating professional development training to this effort, not only in our existing schools, but why are you asking me to expand this training for other staff in other buildings, then show them the data. Show them the data as to why it's important to expand efforts from 1 or 2 schools or 1 or 2 programs to all programs in the system or all buildings in the system. We want to make the case for why we should sustain, if not expand, efforts in implementation of PBIS. Of course, we all know that the bedrock or foundation of PBIS implementation is database decision-making, right? Now, I know that is a buzz or catchphrase that gets tossed around quite a bit and has been as such in education the last few years, but I truly and honestly believe that if you use the data that you already have at your disposal you can make a very compelling case for sustaining and expanding your implementation efforts. And thus, I believe, and we are embracing an approach of looking at the data that you have and using that, shining a big spotlight on those data, but packaging them in a way that makes sense to your consumers and, of course, is tied directly to the evaluation questions that are key for your stakeholders. Since we already know in our PBIS world that data drives what we do, then this should be second nature to all of us. It's just a matter of capitalizing on some different data and packaging them in a particular way. Now, as a program or a school with which you have worked at a systems level, so at a building or a program level, or maybe even at a district level, how have you used data to support, sustain, or expand implementation across the system? And here may be some additional or follow-up prompts to maybe spur some thinking and perhaps, and hopefully so, some sharing by a few of you. Okay, so Becky Millspaw is typing in fidelity inventory reports across school buildings at a cabinet level meeting. So cabinet level meeting, I'm guessing this is a rather large school district that has a cabinet level or school board level. Great. So sharing fidelity of implementation data to school board members or cabinet folks, which is great, upper administration, and using that to drive efforts in terms of future professional development. So fantastic, Becky. Thank you.
I just wanted to share that as far as across our system, we made sure that we use Infinite Campus, that's our student information system. But we made sure that our behavior report, anything that had to do with behavior reporting, resolutions or consequences, lined up with the big five. Just so making sure that we hit the location, the time, the antecedent behavior, that was very important. So we actually set it up so that when our schools are inputting behavior referrals, they had to put down what triggered the behavior. So just to help us really be able to focus on that. So that's one aspect that we did from a system-wide across all of our buildings, and we're almost at 16. We're almost at full. All of our schools are almost at implementing PBIS.
Awesome. Thank you. Consumers and frankly stakeholders of what schools do to the public, to get them acquainted with this, because we're going to keep coming back to them with additional data in subsequent months and years. And we need to help folks outside of our little niche world of PBIS become familiar with some of this stuff. So that's great, Kenneth. Thank you. When we think of evaluations, really there are, and this is a short list, I'm going to whittle it all down to three primary purposes of evaluations. We're talking about systems evaluation. There's a summative approach, which means you're looking at the overall implementation and outcomes at the end of a process. And in our case, it's usually a year, school year, calendar year, whatever is the typical duration of time for your system. Formative evaluations would be throughout the process. And these are more regular appraisals, and we use those to obviously improve implementation and subsequently improve outcomes for individuals much more in real time, or at least in near-term time, than in terms of long-term time. And then we also have our accountability evaluations that are primarily compliance focused. What we're going to be addressing here today is primarily a summative evaluation. When we talk about what is the fidelity of implementation after a year, or what are how well did we achieve specific goals after a year, or the sustainability expansion of tiers, multiple tiers, advanced tiers in our buildings, allocation of human and financial resources. These typically tend to be summative evaluations. Although as I was reviewing my materials earlier this morning, I thought, well, okay, I think I'm right. These are kind of summative evaluations primarily. However, if you use this process year after year after year, in a sense, annual reports of evaluation of our efforts become more like a formative evaluation if you take a much longer, you take a view that is 5, 10, 15 years. And I know we've got sites that have been implementing PBIS for close to 15, if not longer years. An annual evaluation would be technically a summative evaluation, but frankly, it's really a formative evaluation over a much broader or longer period of time. So not to necessarily get too deep into the semantics, that's for a dork like me to really kind of think about, but fundamentally what we're doing are summative evaluations. At the end of a period of time, what have we done and how well did we do it? And was that exactly what we were supposed to do? And so we want to identify what is our purpose. Typically, the purpose of program evaluations at a systems level is to appraise the extent to which we achieved the goals that we had initially established, and then share those results out with the public, and as well use those results to inform future practice. But in order to do that, we got to go through these steps of program evaluation. Once we identified the purpose, then we got to identify stakeholders, who is our team, and what is our timeline. Okay, usually the stakeholders of any systems level evaluation, and this is true outside of the field of education, but we're going to focus obviously on PBIS and the implementation of PBIS in program and school-wide systems. Usually the people who request the evaluation are the stakeholders, but we do not want to forget other stakeholders who maybe didn't initially make the request. Oftentimes, in my experience, that would be families, communities, and while they're not listed here, I would say also business organizations, civic organizations, faith-based organizations that have a vested interest in ensuring that we are meeting the social, emotional, and behavioral needs and supporting the social, emotional, and behavioral health of our community's children, youth, and adolescents. Many years ago, I was consulting in a school district that actively recruited and included business leaders on their PBIS team. Now, they were not in the trenches in terms of implementing Tier 1 PBIS, but they were absolutely involved in the conversations about how can we as civic, business, and even faith-based organizations support the implementation of SWPBIS. And I think that's beautiful. That's what you want. The more people that are involved, the more people that are dedicated to this work, the greater the likelihood that you're going to have a robust amount of support from your community to sustain those efforts. Now, it doesn't mean all those stakeholders are on your evaluation, and I would actually shy away from having an evaluation team that's too large. It becomes way too unwieldy. But minimally, you need to identify who is your stakeholder group. Who are you responding? And then once you've identified who that is, you want to actively involve select individuals from those various stakeholder groups. Now, an evaluation team can be anywhere from an internal only evaluation team all the way up through an external evaluation team, as illustrated by this continuum on this slide. Internal only would be it's largely an evaluation team that is comprised of program or district personnel, nobody from the outside. The exact opposite of that would be an independent or external evaluation team in which all the members of that evaluation team are disassociated directly from the program or the district. Now, there are pros and cons to each one of those extremes of the continuum. I tend to advise on somewhere in the middle, where you have both external consultants who advise the evaluation team, and they are part of those stakeholder groups that aren't necessarily directly involved in the day-to-day operation of SWPBIS or program-wide PBIS, but at least have some knowledge and awareness of it, and they have a vested interest in understanding what's going on and appraising that information and share. Having those folks, as well as having district or program-wide people on your team as well. So I tend to gravitate toward the middle of the continuum. Therefore, you have individuals who this is just what they do every single day as part of their job because they're program or district level people, as well as outsiders, because it's always good to have an outsider who's double checking us to make sure they're not straying from what we're supposed to be doing, having a unique, very informative insight into something that maybe we all take for granted that anybody outside of the PBIS bubble is completely unaware of. And therefore, I think a middle of the road constitution of your evaluation team is likely to be a best option. Of course, this means you got another team, and we all know from schools and programs that we have way too many teams to be on. Therefore, make sure that when you're constituting an evaluation team, each member of the team has a specific role, has a purpose, and they have a skill set that they can meaningfully contribute to the evaluation. All the more reason, in my opinion, you keep your evaluation team rather small. Now, I generally advise against a specific number, but I am willing to go out on a limb and say, well, perhaps maybe an evaluation team of anywhere from 5 to 7 people. Of course, that is going to depend largely on how broad of a scope of your evaluation are you going to have. If you're, say, for example, the School District of Philadelphia, then you're probably going to have a much larger evaluation team than you would be if you are in the Austin School District, which has, I believe, one of our smallest student populations, if I'm not mistaken. So it's going to vary depending on the size of the system and how broad of scope your systems level evaluation is going to be. But you do want to have an evaluation team that has a specific role, each member has a role, has a purpose, and they have skills that they meaningfully contribute to the work of the evaluation team, because these evaluations are done by this evaluation team. So they need the time, they need the resources, and they need the expertise. And without any of those, it's going to be very difficult for your evaluation team to do what it needs to do. The next thing, once you've established who that team is going to be, you have to set a timeline. Typically, at least in the PBIS world, whether it's program-wide or school-wide, typically our timeline for the start of an evaluation to its eventual conclusion is typically a year. Now, that year could be based upon your school or program calendar, or it could be based on the actual, more January to December calendar. Whichever, doesn't much matter, but you typically are doing it for an annual term. However, there are short-term goals that have to be established by the evaluation team in order to achieve that long-term goal. It's no different than, say, an IEP or a family support plan that has a long-term goal and has subsequent short-term goals. It's no different. And those short-term goals are all focused along these steps of the evaluative process. Those steps would include establishing the purpose, the stakeholders, the evaluation team, what are the questions, what are the data analysis and reporting mechanisms. Those are all the steps in the process. And what may be helpful or beneficial would be mapping it out. Here is an illustration of a Gantt chart for a system that was designing a timeline for conducting an annual systems level evaluation that they wanted to have completed by the end of the calendar year. But they recognized that back in January, they need to establish the purpose, and then in January through February, identify who the stakeholders are, and subsequently are around the same time, and maybe taking a few extra weeks to firm up who is a member of the evaluation team based upon who those stakeholder groups are, and so forth. This broad time frame gives us the long-term objective or long-term goal, which is to finish by the end of December. But what are all the intermediate steps that have to be accomplished in order for us to successfully achieve our long-term goal? These broadly on the left-hand side would be the steps of the process. And this is not the only slide or visual representation of it. It's embedded throughout this entire presentation in terms of the agenda and also some of the main sections of the content in the presentation. So we've already talked about identifying a purpose, identifying stakeholders, and then establishing who your evaluation team is. And then once the evaluation team has been defined and constituted, then that team needs to, in earnest, establish a timeline for completing its work. And it's been my experience that you typically want to look at it from the broad view of 1 year, and then chunking down those individual steps backward from the time at which you want to have the evaluation reports completed and produced for public consumption. And therefore, those are the first number of steps in the process. I'm going to pause for a moment and see if anybody has any questions. If you do, either type them in the chat or raise your hand and I will call upon. This is where the fun really begins. Now, don't let me mislead you into believing that the first couple of steps are unimportant. They absolutely are. But this is where I get all jazzed. I get super excited because now you get to get down into the nitty gritty of what are we going to evaluate and how are we going to do it? And then let's go about and implement what we want to evaluate. And that in sum is developing our evaluation questions, selecting our measures, and then conducting and reporting the result. When you're developing your core evaluation questions, I would advise first and foremost that if you're doing this for the very first time, keep the number of evaluation questions small. Make it manageable. As I have learned evaluating PBIS at a statewide level for the past 12 going on 13 years, there is a lot of opportunity for you to try to bite off way more than you can possibly chew. And if you do that, then you may be somewhat disappointed in not achieving your goals of completing that evaluation by the end of your time. So pick a small number of evaluation questions. And the National Center on PBIS recommends or suggests that there are essentially 5 broad categories of evaluation questions. Now, admittedly, the ones that get the most excitement or get the most attention are the fidelity and outcomes areas. But please remember that the top 3, in terms of their visual orientation, not necessarily top three in terms of importance, but top three on this slide, reach, process, and capacity are just as important. They're just not quite as sexy or as glamorous as fidelity and outcomes. And therefore, I would encourage you to consider evaluative questions that focus on reach, process, and capacity, in addition to fidelity and outcomes, but keep them to a manageable number. Let's break down each one of these in subsequent slides. What I am about to do is share with you some examples of potential questions as well as possible data sources for each of these 5 areas. This is absolutely not an exhaustive list. An exhaustive list, A, is impossible and impractical to produce because I don't know your individual context, I don't know your individual settings, I don't know much about your sites. And therefore, creating an exhaustive list is impossible. But here are some more common research questions that you might find in a systems level analysis of PBIS implementation. Starting out with the area that is broadly referred to as REACH. And REACH describes who is participating in PBIS. Some common questions might include how many programs or schools or families, community organizations are involved. To what extent PBIS is scaled across the agency, local educational agency, county, or IU, or whatever your organizational structure is. To what extent has PBIS been sustained? So those are some common questions that we see in systems level evaluations of PBIS. Now, when you think of these common questions, you also need to be almost a half a second later be thinking about, do we have data to actually answer those questions? Because you can come up with some really awesome questions, but have no way of measuring them. I do that all the time when I'm looking at the data at the statewide level. I'm like, ooh, that'd be a really cool question. And then I quickly realize, or my research assistants will tell me, we don't have data to answer that. And then I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, an idea for maybe next. Some common data sources might be the counts of programs or schools that are involved, whether they're participating and they're implementing. Right now, we're just talking about participating in PBIS and PBIS. We're not getting into fidelity of implementation just yet. That's for a different broad category of 5. Counts of organizations, maybe even naming the organizations, identifying the number of students that are involved in programs or schools that are participating. At the statewide level, and you will find this in our executive summary that Tina noted much earlier in the session today, we list by name all of the collaborating mental health and behavioral health agencies that provide support to schools implementing PBIS. We want to publicly name them because we want them to be publicly acknowledged for supporting schools. And that list continues to grow. At last count, it was over 200. And I know that grows every year. So we name them. And we were able to name that because all of you are providing those data in PTRAC, by the way. So thank you for doing that. But we list those out. And you could do the same thing, publicly acknowledging the institutions, the organizations, the business organizations, individuals in the community who are actively supporting your effort. We want to share with our community that PBIS is not just a school or a program thing. This is a community. And we want to thank and reinforce the individuals outside of the school or program buildings that are supportive of those efforts. We also, at the statewide level, we take stock of how many kids are in the school buildings that are participating in PBIS implementation. And so we get enrollment data from PDE and also from all of you, and then we count them all up. We say, okay, of the how many hundreds of thousands of kids there are in Pennsylvania public schools, public and private and charter schools and so forth, how many of them are actually in schools that are implementing PBIS? Because that's a good number to know. What proportion of the student population is being directly impacted by PBIS implementation? So those could be some things you could look at in terms of the reach, the scope of our work. One key domain to consider from an evaluative perspective. Process is what's happening with PBIS. Some common questions might be what leadership team activities have occurred. Here's another one that we do see quite a bit, professional development. So what professional development has occurred, as well as maybe the effects of that professional development or the satisfaction of that professional development. A few years ago, back when we used to actually have implementers fora in person, the patent offices would share the satisfaction surveys that folks completed as they exited the implementers fora. And we would analyze those data to appraise the extent to which people who went to the forum actually thought it was helpful, benefited from it, thought the sessions were of high quality, and were able to network with colleagues across the state. Those data were analyzed very specifically because we wanted to assess the extent to which the process is achieving its goals. Why are we having implementers for? Well, yeah, sure, we all like to get together at Hershey, the sweetest place on earth, and more recently get together online and hopefully soon back face-to-face. I know it's not happening this fall, but sometime soon, maybe we'll be back face-to-face. It's important that we, to our stakeholders, share the extent to which that is having its desired effect. Otherwise, why are districts and programs paying money and providing resources for staff to go to these sessions? Why are we paying for professional development activities? Why are we doing all these things? And why, in this increasingly challenging time, in terms of multiple or competing priorities for professional development, why should PBIS be the one that we focus on in terms of our use the data to make the argument? And here are some possible examples of how you could do that. That's process. Then we get into capacity. What's the ability to sustain and implement PBIS? Some common questions as you see listed there on the left. And our common data sources, the number one is, of course, going to be our fidelity measures, which all of us are very, very familiar with. But some data sources that may be less familiar to many of us could include resource mapping. This happens a lot, especially at systems level, when you have multiple organizations that are braiding or blending resources to support an effort. So sharing with your stakeholder groups that such and such agency is providing this amount of resource in support of implementation of PBIS at, say, tier 2 or tier 3 in a school building. That's very helpful for school boards and communities to know, oh my, I didn't realize that such and such external organization, external to the school, an organization external to the school is providing that amount of assistance. That's wonderful. That's what we need to share. I know what's happening, and this is a vehicle by which you can do that. Budget reviews, human capital, coaching logs for those of us who are internal or external coaches. You can use those mine those data to help really establish the extent to which an organization has the capacity to implement and sustain PBIS implementation. And some of those others, one that I had not really been using had never used until very, very recently, was changes in policies and MOUs between organizations. That those things happen, and it's important to highlight those as efforts to increase the capacity to implement and sustain PBIS implementation. Again, these are just short lists, general recommendations, but some things from the field that I have seen and have used myself as well. All right, so those are the first three areas. The last two areas of the five are the ones that I noted earlier, are much more glamorous, get much more attention. And frankly, I'm just as guilty as the next. These are the ones that I almost always go to. I'm like, ooh, I'm going to jump ahead to these. So that's fidelity. We all know you can have a great plan, but if no one implements it, it was just a great plan on paper. And it didn't have any positive effect on kids, youth, adolescents, or staff. Therefore, we must evaluate fidelity of implementation. And for my 2 cents, when you're looking at outcomes, which is the fifth or last domain of program evaluation or systems level evaluation for PBIS, everything has to be tied to fidelity. Without fidelity data, then our evaluation of impact on kids, staff, and communities is largely meaningless. We can't attribute it at all to PBIS implementation unless we have data to support that it was actually implemented. So fidelity is key, which is why myself, your patent counterparts, all of us at the IU level, down to the schools, always are hounding on fidelity, 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 and collect fidelity data. We want to know the extent to which school systems and program systems are implementing tiers 1, 2, and 3. Of course, you could use any one of the available measures. I would actually encourage you to de-emphasize the self-assessment survey, the SAS. That is not necessarily nearly as empirically established as a good fidelity measure as the others. I do, however, receive a number of questions from folks in the field. Which should I use, TFI, BOQ, the early childhood BOQ, or the SET? Doesn't matter. They're all equally as good. Kent McIntosh and colleagues a couple of years ago published an article in the Journal of Positive Behavior Interventions, unequivocally establishing that TFI, BOQ, SET are all, for our purposes, equivalent in terms of their rigor for establishment of Tier 1 SWPBIS and again, we don't have a sister or counterpart for early childhood, but you definitely have the early childhood BOQ, which is firmly established as being a high quality fidelity measure. Of course, everybody, I hope, knows that the TFI is the only measure that we have for tier 2 and 3 implementation fidelity. So if you're measuring fidelity at tier 2 and tier 3, you are left with just the you're left with the TFI. Just would suggest that it's imperfect, but it's also quite good. And thank you, Sue Zeiters, for noting that early childhood also can use the TFI. So thank you for that. Some other common data sources would be coaches' logs. That would be in terms of providing support at a targeted level for staff to implement some of the characteristics or features of PBIS, whether it's at tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. That could certainly be helpful. Bringing one or a tool that those of us who've been around for a couple of decades are familiar with, the initial line of inquiry, developed by some of at least my predecessors in the PBIS world, Tim Nosler, Greg Llewellyn, and others. It's a function-based intervention planning process. You can look at some of those data as well. These are all just data. If you don't have any of these data sources or you're unfamiliar with them, then don't try and go out and find them. Just use what you have available. I'm just offering up suggestions as to what data you might have around that could be beneficial to this effort. And also one that I have been working with schools in recent years as part of some grant work, but then also just some consulting with them, is referrals and access to mental health services that are provided either at a school or program site. So school-based mental health services that are provided either by in-house staff or by collaborating agencies, as well as referrals and access to mental health services for those services being provided outside of school, which I hope many of us would understand results in probably fewer actual limited accessibility to mental health services because of barriers to accessing community-based mental health services, although it doesn't mean we give up on that. It's just hard for many individuals. But as we see increasing amounts of school-based behavioral health services being supplied on site, that might be another set of data that you could harvest to look at the fidelity with which your advanced tiers of support are being implemented, particularly at tier 3, when you're talking about small group mental health, behavioral health services that are being provided on site. That would be another set of data. So that's fidelity. Then the fifth and final category of evaluative questions that can be asked and then subsequently operationalized and collecting data and analyzed would be around outcomes. And this, again, is the one that tends to get the most attention because it's the one that focuses on what did it do? What did our efforts do? What was the impact of our efforts for this past year on students, staff, and community members? And this one, in my experience, tends to be the area in which you can generate a lot of evaluative questions. And therefore, I caution, if you're doing this for the first time or you're a relative novice at this, I would strongly recommend that you just develop a very small number of questions, 2, 3, maybe 4 questions. Get your feet wet, do it well on a small scale before you start to expand it. I learned this the hard way. In year 1 of our program evaluation for SWPBIS, almost 13 years ago, I thought we could analyze every ounce of data that we got. And that was back when we only had about 40 schools. And that was really hard to do with just 40 schools. And it has nothing to do with the 40 schools. It had everything to do with us. We didn't have the internal capacity to do that, to do a whole lot of evaluative questions with just 40 schools. And now that we're at over 1,000, close pushing 1,100, there's no way we can answer a whole host of evaluative questions, even if we had gobs and gobs of resources, which of course nobody has. Consequently, I'm advising that you pick a small number of outcomes-focused evaluative questions that address student-level issues and maybe even adult, such as staff or teacher questions or policies, and always, always, always relate this to the fidelity of implementation. As we all know, the only way that you can attribute the efficacy of PBIS implementation on a perceived change in outcome data is if you have fidelity data to support that PBIS was actually implemented. Therefore, you've got to have fidelity data as your foundation for then subsequently interpreting your outcomes data through the lens of how well were we implementing. And I do have a tool here that I'm going to eventually get to that shares how you could potentially do that, because we need to have fidelity data that is wedded to our outcome data. Common data sources, ODRs, or in the younger population, the behavior incident reports, out of school suspensions, expulsions. You can see the long list that I have provided there. Again, not intended to be exhaustive, but this tends to be some of the more common ones that I see. Notice at the very bottom of that list, I'm saying everything has to be tied to fidelity data. Tie it to fidelity data, because if your ODRs or BIRs changed and you have no fidelity data for that same year, then you can't say PBIS was the cause of or even had an association with your change in ODRs. It could have been something completely outside of implementation fidelity. You have to have implementation fidelity data to corroborate that if there is in fact a change or an achievement of a goal that you have established as an evaluation team is at least associated with implementation of SWPBIS or program-wide. Here are just, again, I think it's just, I only have 3 questions, but you could have, there's an unlimited number of questions. Here's some sample evaluative questions. Have incident reports changed since we implemented Tier 1 program-wide PBIS? In other words, what were our BIRs last year when we weren't implementing PBIS? And what are our BIRs now after this year, subsequent to implementing Tier 1 PBIS? And we've got the early childhood BOQ to prove that we were implementing PBIS in our program for this current academic year. That could be one evaluative question. Another one, have we reduced out-of-school placements by at least 50% since implementing all 3 tiers of PBIS? So be another one. So you have to know what were your out-of-school placement rates prior to implementing all 3 tiers and what are they now? And you have to have fidelity data to confirm that all 3 tiers were implemented to criteria. Or another one, what percentage of students are chronically absent now that we have implemented Check and Connect? I know in some of the schools that I've been working with in the last year or two, particularly as we've gone to virtual learning, or at least a hybrid model, we're losing kids left and right. They're just not showing up. And so Check and Connect has been strongly recommended as an intervention to be used to get kids engaged, or at least minimally logging into Zoom or Google Meets for their classes. So you want to know what percentage of kids were chronically absent prior to you implementing Check and Connect, and now how many are you achieving, or how many kids, how well have you reduced that chronic absentee rate now that you've implemented Check and Connect, and of course have fidelity data to corroborate that Check and Connect was in fact implemented. Of course, there is an unlimited number of evaluative questions, no doubt, but I hope this gives you an idea as to some of the broad categories and potential questions that could be asked within those broad categories. So we've developed our evaluation questions. Next step then, you got to select your evaluation measures. Your evaluation questions should lead directly to the data sources that you have. Data sources that are effective for our purposes at a system-wide level are data that are available, easy to understand, and linked to action planning. Well, of course, you want to use data that you already have available. Don't make this any harder for yourself than it needs to be. Use existing data to help answer the questions that you have devised. There's no sense in trying to create another set of data that people have to then go collect, because it creates undue burden on a system that frankly is probably already stretched pretty thin. So use available data. Make sure that your data are easy to understand. I have no idea if I want to exit the highway if I see a road sign like this. It could be a wonderful experience going to a zoo. It could be a surprise, or it could be very, very scary. Who knows? And I'm certainly not going to camp there because it seems like this exit is quite dangerous, at least potentially. Now, I'm not kidding you. This is a sign that I saw in Western New York when I recently traveled up there with family for a state prison. This is very clear. I said to the kids, we're not stopping and picking up any hitchhikers here because this is a little bit of an obvious sign for us. You want to have data that are easy to understand. The easier it is to understand for your consumers, the less you have to explain, and importantly, the less misinterpretation is going to occur. So find data that are available and easy to understand. And those data should also be linked to what are you going to do with those data. They should lead to action planning. Many of you might be familiar with the SMART acronym that we use to identify a process of collecting data and then using those data to action planning. So I think the SMART process is a very wise, pun absolutely intended, a very wise way of using data to drive your action planning. So collect data that are specific, they're measurable, you've identified a goal that is achievable, it's realistic, and then it's time-based, and you use that to then action plan around how to interpret the data and then use those data for continuous improvement. Again, fundamentally, your data systems are available, easy to understand, and linked to action planning. I wish I had more on this, but it's really going to be a matter of what data do you already have. Take an inventory of what data you have and use those extant data sources to answer or respond to the evaluation questions. This might also require you to go back and maybe reshape your evaluation questions based upon the available data. For example, you might have a really wonderful evaluation question and then realize you don't have the data to answer that question, or it's going to take an ungodly amount of resources for you to get those data. And so you abandon that evaluation question. But you establish your evaluation questions, identify the data sources, then maybe circle back just to double check that your evaluation questions are still relevant and achievable in terms of the data sources that you have available, which then leads to conducting and reporting on your results. You want to stick to your original evaluation questions. That's your roadmap. Don't deviate from that roadmap. Know who your audience is. I know that if I'm presenting to folks such as you, I don't have to explain what a TFI is or a BOQ is or a set. But if I'm presenting to a school board member or I'm presenting to community members, I absolutely need to be cognizant of that and know who my audience is and prepare my presentation differently. So know who your audience is. And remember, that's one of the very first steps of the process is identifying the purpose of the evaluation. If you know the purpose, then you largely know who your audience is. Therefore, when conducting and sharing your results, be mindful of that audience. Present in a manner and a modality that is best suited for your audience, whether it be brochures, visuals. I increasingly am enjoying and appreciating visual representations as the primary way of sharing information. I wish I was a skilled graphics designer to create those infographics. I am not. That is why I have other people do that good stuff for me, because I cannot do it. But being able to succinctly and accurately display information in a visual format is going to be wonderful for most audiences. Subsequently, as you can imagine, I'm advocating for visual representations as much as possible. And you want to focus on trends across years and, when possible, because you have fidelity data to do this, make pre-post comparisons, baseline versus implementation, and make those visual contrasts of pre and post pop out. And as you'll see here in just a moment, I tried to do that in some illustrations of how you could potentially share pre-post comparisons of some of your data. What I have now are a series of slides just illustrating from the field, and thank you to my colleagues across the state who shared some of theirs, which we de-identified to protect the confidence of the sources of these data. But I've got a series of slides that do some of these pre-post comparisons, or at least longitudinal or trend analyses of some data. So here's one for the teapot, looking at some of our indicators of key features of basically good instruction in a PBIS framework at the preschool level. You could look at early childhood BOQ data, so fidelity data across 3 different periods of time. So the end of one academic year versus the beginning of the next academic year, and then the end of that same academic year, being mindful of the dates listed down at the bottom. So here is a nice visual representation that is already available in your PBIS apps accounts. Don't need to recreate the wheel. Just use what's available in PBIS apps. If you're going to use PBIS, especially at the school-wide level, I would encourage you to be sensitive to the visual display that is produced in PBIS apps. I love PBIS apps. I think it's great. Gives you, for example, TFI data across a 3 school year period. My only criticism, and I failed to bring this up with Kent McIntosh when he was with our state coordinators team just last week, is my only criticism is for those who have visual acuity or color blindness, I really dislike how they have 2 different shades of green next to a blue. Bad idea. And therefore, if you truly want to be inclusive, you might want to consider taking these raw data, putting them into something like Excel and generating your own report. I realize that's an extra couple of steps, but it is being mindful of those individuals who maybe have a little bit of a difficult time distinguishing between the graphs that are produced in PBIS apps. Here's one for the subscales on the TFI. Again, would encourage you to maybe reconstitute this using Excel and making those bars visually distinct so that it creates less confusion for our colleagues with visual impairments. You could also do BIQ, total scores, longitudinally. I mean, this is a nice, easy. So if I was presenting to a school board, I wouldn't tell them, I wouldn't go through all that. Like, this is what the BOQ is, it stands for the benchmark. I wouldn't tell them how many items are on it. I'd just say, we want the bars to go up. Up is good. And we're seeing things generally going up. That means our schools are getting better at implementing PBIS at tier 1. That's all they need to know because I know my audience. And if one of the audience members happens to know what the BOQ is, I'll meet with them afterward and share a little bit more because they have a deeper understanding of it. But for largely, know your audience. So again, PBIS apps gives us these wonderful reports that you can use. Use them. Here is one for the BOQ subscales. Again, might want to consider reconstituting using less visually similar bars, but again, an illustration of what you can harness from existing and available reports. School safety report, here we do have the blue-green issues. Again, I know I'm kind of harping on this, but hopefully the point here is that you can use many, if not most of these reports in PBIS apps to your benefit. You'll literally just copy the image and paste it into whatever report you're generating for your stakeholders. So I'm going to conclude here with something that is not nearly as sophisticated as PBIS apps, excuse me. It's not nearly as sophisticated because I created it, which tells you something, actually probably tells you a lot. Now, this is something that I hope folks would be willing to use. And as was noted earlier in our session, I'm going to be sharing the PowerPoint with Tina, and then she'll push it out. I will also be sharing this resource as well. This is completely homegrown. It is relatively low tech, but that's because I'm somewhat of a low tech individual, but also I wanted it to be somewhat user friendly, even for folks who are not as familiar with something like Excel. Now, I love Excel, but I also realize that for this reason, as well as many others, I'm in the minority. I love Excel. So that's just me. What I have tried to do is capture with screenshots how to use this Excel template to build visual representations of some of the more common data that could be used to tell your program or school-wide story. So you will notice that there are tabs for each individual worksheet along the bottom, and there are a bunch of them. There is a whole lot of them. For each of these tabs, there are actually groups of 3. Every group of 3 has a set of directions, which has everything spelled out, including some screenshots to help hopefully minimize errors, as well as an example, and then a template that has no data in it that you put in, which will then automatically generate a visual representation. Again, the directions, an example, and then a blank template for you to enter in the data. I have a set for incident reports for our program-wide colleagues. I have one for ODRs. I'm going to show you what these look like in a little bit more detail in just a moment. I have a set for office discipline referrals. I have one for office discipline referral triangle data. That would be only applicable for schools that are using SWIS and have access to triangle data. I have a set for out-of-school suspensions. I have a set for office discipline referral and fidelity data superimposed on the same graph. So this one, you have office discipline referral data that are the blue bars, and then the fidelity data are the X's, and they have a corresponding y-axis on the right-hand side. I also have this built in for out-of-school suspension fidelity data as out-of-school suspension and fidelity data as well. So a lot of different clusters of worksheets. Again, for each one of these, there are 3 worksheets. So let me go back to an illustration. So here is the ODR example. Again, these are completely made up data. Even if they weren't made up data, I have not identified who the school is, but these are completely made up data. So you plug in the school year, the number of school days, the number of students, and then the cumulative number of office discipline referrals. By the way, those of you who are familiar with PTRAC, these are all the data that you're asked to enter into PTRAC. So there's nothing different. You're already collecting this for PTRAC purposes. If you use PTRAC but do not use SWIS, just enter in these data and it automatically populates this last column. I've got the formula built in, so you don't have to do it yourself. If you happen to be a Swiss user, then you can skip over these two columns and you just plop in your ODR data from Swiss right there. When you do that, it automatically creates the graph. Now you may notice in this graph, I have a black bar here. What is that black bar? That's your visual representation of pre-implementation ODR rates. The directions walk you through how to enter or populate the data, and then how to format the graph to give you, say, for example, what's a pre-implementation or baseline year? Or how do you get the actual numbers to appear above the graph? Again, some of these directions are intended for folks who are relatively novice at using Excel and generating graphs. If you're a moderate to advanced user, then many of these directions will be irrelevant or unnecessary. But I tried to develop this in a manner that would maximize benefit to individuals across the levels of familiarity and comfort with using Excel. Here is the blank. So you literally just start entering or populating the data, and it creates the graph. So for each one of these, I've got a set of directions with screenshots for the more nuanced set of steps. I've got a blank where you populate your data, and then examples to maybe see where or what it should look like if you're following the directions correctly. I created this. I had some assistance from some of my students to go through it to make sure it was free of errors, but we are also humans and there might be an error. So if somebody finds an error, let me know and I will fix it and I will send it out again. I want this to be correct and helpful. So please give me feedback, both positive and corrective, if there are things that could be done to improve the quality of this. But for my 2 cents, what I would suggest you consider doing is using this to build a couple of simple graphs, especially if you're unfamiliar or accustomed to building graphs in Excel. And then you can hover over your image, and if you right-click on the image, you can copy it, and then you can paste it into Word, into whatever you're using. So I can open up a Word document. And here's a little fun fact that you're not as familiar with copying and pasting into Excel. When you paste, you want to make sure you paste this last icon is the picture. If you paste it as a picture, then you can resize it and it doesn't, the scaling remains intact. If you inadvertently paste it as, say, for example, source formatting, one of the other images, watch when I resize it. Notice that I start losing the content. So you don't want to do that. This is a non-example. The example is you want to paste it as a picture. If you paste it as a picture, then you can resize it all you want and everything stays intact. So you can hopefully see that if you use something as crude and rudimentary as my Excel spreadsheet, you can copy and then paste this into a Word document, which becomes the source of your report that you're going to share with your stakeholder groups. Again, there are certainly other things you can do, but this is maybe a good initial set of steps you can take to create some visual displays of your data. And that concludes everything that I wanted to review.